Joe Biden remains the presumptive Democratic nominee, but does that mean he'll be the presidential candidate the Democrats will actually be voting for in the 2020 general election? That's the curious question we'll explore on today's edition of Connecticut Yankee Sanity. Mr. Biden is still leading in most polls, trailed by either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, with Kamala Harris a distant fourth. As with the first time I spoke about him, we won't elaborate on his blemishes as a candidate. Plagiarism, low wattage intellect, touchy-feely tendencies around women, lack of charisma, weak debating skills, and millions of dollars of family wealth accumulated by the merest coincidence during his many years as a government employee. At the moment, he has no serious competition, although Mrs. Warren is working on that. I naturally discount Mr. Sanders, as in 2016, his chances of becoming the Democratic nominee are roughly those of a snowstorms occurring in hell in midsummer. It ain't going to happen. Lots of teenagers and adults with arrested emotional development think socialism would be great, but a recent Gallup poll confirms that the majority of Americans not undergoing psychotherapy remain unconvinced. So for fun, let's imagine that Mr. Biden actually has a chance of winning the presidency in 2020, and let our imaginations dwell on that fantasy. He'd be a one-termer, and maybe not even that. The choice of the VP candidate for the Democrats is therefore critical, more critical than Biden himself. Sorry, Joe, but you're a consenting adult and you took the job. In short, Mr. Biden will be the opening act for whomever is running as president in waiting. Given that premise, the DNC has been obsessed for decades with getting a woman into the presidency. Preferably, she'd be a woman of color, as they charmingly put it, when their preference, as is usual these days, is for someone who's not white. Hence their fascination with Kamala Harris. Mr. Biden himself has said, "I think it'd be great to have a female VP," although it's unlikely he had in mind the ferocious Miss Harris when he said it. In March, when he was toying with the idea of announcing a running mate during the primaries rather than at the nominating convention as is traditional, rumors circulated that the nod might go to the roly-poly, frizzy-haired Stacey Abrams, but nothing came of it. The campaign quietly moved on, leaving Miss Abrams behind to offer her services as VP to anybody else in the lineup who might take a fancy to her. I think we can safely conclude that Mr. Biden's running mate will be picked from the distaff side of the Democratic roster. Who will be the anointed one? Mr. Biden is in the awkward position of having to play to the radical left wing of the party. Since he's not a particularly good salesman for socialism, and since Mr. Sanders disqualifies on age and race as well as gender, that leaves the fiery Elizabeth Warren, or the equally incendiary Kamala Harris. None of the other women in the race at the moment has a detectable political pulse. Let's consider Elizabeth Warren first. She's Mr. Biden's real competition for the presidential nomination. Her ambition rings out like a Chinese gong, and she has done a good job of metamorphosing into a leftist worthy of Lenin himself. But she's not that much younger than Biden, and of course, she's a fair-skinned, blue-eyed blonde, which puts her at a disadvantage in a party that goes in big for exotic, boutique candidates. Besides, she wants to be the big cheese in her own right, and there's the rub. Ascending to the presidency as a consequence of having entered the White House on Mr. Biden's coattails as VP, which everyone knows is largely a ceremonial position, might be too undignified for her, even if Uncle Joe wanted her. Can you imagine Mrs. Warren running for anything but the presidency? I can't. No. She either ascends to the top nomination on her own and climbs into the ring with a Trumpster to get biffed into oblivion, or she waves bye-bye and goes off to write her memoirs. And so we come to Kamala Harris. Thanks to Tulsi Gabbard's smacking her up alongside the head in the last round of debates, she has descended into the boring single digits and stayed there. Until I began thinking about this video, I was feeling smug satisfaction over that, figuring she'd slink back to the Socialist Republic of California to enjoy its ongoing descent into third world bliss and not bother us anymore. Now, I'm not so sure. Her chances of becoming the president on her own, either in 2020 or 2024, ain't looking so good. but that just means she'd be an ideal pick for the VP slot. There's little doubt she'd jump at the chance. What has she got to lose? From the party's point of view, she's female, well-tanned, ethnic, radical, and meaner than a pit bull that hasn't eaten for weeks. She'd be a dream pick for Biden as his socialist emissary to the far left wing of the party, and add juice to what otherwise promises to be a pretty dull campaign. Moreover, she's in perfect harmony with the Dems' long-term goals and newfound socialist inclinations. Don't be surprised if she rejoins the fray as the vice presidential nominee. Perhaps we ought to count on it, and that's my take. I'll add as a footnote that geriatric presidential politics can have its ups and downs. Here's an example from, by today's standards, ancient history. In 1925, World War I war hero Paul von Hindenburg allowed himself to be persuaded to run for president of Germany, which was in economic and political turmoil. He was the same age as Joe Biden is now. He won the election, but by the time he was up for re-election at age 84, Adolf Hitler's following and power were growing. Hindenburg defeated him in the presidential election of 1932, but under pressure appointed him as chancellor, the equivalent of prime minister. 2 years later, when Hindenburg departed for Valhalla, the mythical home of deceased European warriors, Hitler became dictator, and the rest we know. Nothing so drastic would likely befall us here. Mr. Biden, as president, probably won't be called upon to cope with an Antifa uprising on a par with the Nazi movement in 1930s Germany, or at least I hope not. The United States is not Deutschland. But wait a minute. Let's bring this fantasizing to a close and return to reality. Whoever becomes Mr. Biden's VP candidate, but especially if it's a socialist wannabe like Harris, the Democrats are not going to regain the presidency in 2020. They may well lose the House. As if desiring both outcomes, their strategy seems calculated to help Mr. Trump get reelected, perhaps so they can spend a further 4 years squawking about impeaching him. Although every destructive strategy they've undertaken since he won the presidency has failed, collusion with Russia, labeling him as a racist, homophobic, misogynistic monster of depravity with orange hair and small hands who hates pretty much everyone and everything, in addition to being a bungling idiot at both domestic and foreign policy, this time the Dems may succeed thumpingly. Presented with Mr. Biden as a lifeless figurehead candidate, with a leftist radical as his VP and heir apparent, mainstream Democrats, if they vote at all, may trek to the polls out of self-defense to vote for the Trumpster, and do so by the millions, as they did for Reagan over Mondale Ferraro in 1984. It could happen. Thanks for watching. Please click like and subscribe, and forward the link on to your friends to support the channel. We'll see you back here next time.